The folder was sitting right there on the kitchen counter when I got home that Tuesday evening. A thick manila envelope with the name of my property management company printed in the return address corner, the kind that needed a signature from the owner of record before they could finalize the new commercial lease agreements for the ground floor units. I was still in my work clothes, still carrying my bag over one shoulder, and I almost didn't notice it because Derek had stacked his own mail on top of it, the way he always did, as if the counter existed primarily to organize his correspondence, and everything else was just background noise in what he considered his house. I moved his mail to the side, picked up the envelope, and set it on the desk in the small room I used as a home office. The room he had once suggested I convert into a proper guest bedroom, because, as he put it, I didn't really need that much space for my things. I was 31 years old that evening, and I'd been married to Derek Callahan for 4 years. I had known his mother, Constance Callahan, for 5. And in all that time, through every holiday dinner and Sunday lunch and birthday celebration, she had turned into an opportunity to remind me of my place. I had never once told her that the building she lived in, the sleek 12-story mixed-use property on the corner of Peachtree and 6th in Midtown Atlanta, Georgia, with the wine bar on the ground floor and the rooftop terrace that she bragged about to her church friends, belonged to me. Not to Derek, not to our marriage, not to some trust fund or family inheritance she could claim adjacency to me. Serena Watkins Callahan, daughter of a woman who cleaned office buildings for 22 years, and a father who drove a delivery truck until his back gave out. Owner of record since the age of 27 of a property appraised at just under $8.2 million, acquired through a combination of disciplined saving, strategic partnership with an investor I met through a commercial real estate certification program, and the kind of quiet, relentless planning that Constance Callahan would never have given me credit for, even if I had handed her the deed and explained it in single syllables. She had made that abundantly clear over 5 years of making sure I understood exactly what she thought of me. I remember the first time she looked at me across a dinner table and said, very calmly, as if commenting on the weather, that Derek had always been meant for someone with a certain kind of background. Not in a cruel way, she had said, just practically speaking, the way you prepare a child for the reality of the world. I was sitting right there. I smiled and reached for my water glass and said nothing, because I was 26 years old, and I still believed that silence in those moments was grace. I didn't know yet that she had mistaken my grace for compliance. That mistake would take years to fully correct, but the correction, when it came, was thorough. To understand how I arrived at that Tuesday evening with a manila envelope and a mother-in-law who did not know she was living in my building, I have to go back further, to the version of me that existed before I understood what I was actually dealing with, and to the version of my marriage that looked, from the outside, like something worth envying. I met Derek Callahan when I was 25, working as a junior analyst at a commercial real estate investment firm in Atlanta's Buckhead neighborhood. He was charming in the specific way that men who have been told their whole lives that they are exceptional tend to be charming. Easy with compliments, confident in rooms, quick to make you feel like you were the most interesting person in them. He was 30 at the time, working in financial advisory, and he had the kind of easy polish that comes from growing up in a family where money was simply assumed, never discussed, never worried about. His family wasn't wealthy by Atlanta's highest standards, but Constance had made a career of presenting herself as the kind of woman who moved in elevated circles, and she had trained Derek to represent that image accordingly. I was not the image she had in mind for her son. She was not subtle about it. From the first time Derek brought me to a family dinner at the house in Sandy Springs, a 4-bedroom colonial that Constance had kept immaculate since her husband passed 8 years earlier, she positioned herself carefully. She complimented my dress in a tone that implied she found it brave that I had chosen it. She asked about my family with the particular interest of someone taking inventory rather than making conversation. When I mentioned that my mother had recently retired after more than 2 decades of facility maintenance, Constance smiled in a way that didn't involve her eyes and said that was just wonderful, that she had always admired people who weren't afraid of physical work, as if she were awarding me a participation ribbon. I noticed everything. Always. I just didn't let her see that I noticed, which was perhaps the single best decision I made in the entire first year of knowing her. What Constance didn't know, what Derek himself didn't know in those early months, was that I had been planning my financial life with a kind of seriousness that would have surprised most people who looked at my age and my background and made their assumptions. I had started working at the real estate firm at 22, straight out of Georgia State, and I had spent the first 3 years there absorbing everything I could about commercial acquisition, valuation, and financing structures. I lived in a studio apartment in East Atlanta that cost me $620 a month, ate lunch at my desk most days, and put every extra dollar into a brokerage account and a high-yield savings account while I studied for a commercial real estate license in the evenings. By the time I met Derek, I had saved $43,000 and was already in preliminary conversations with Marcus Webb, a real estate investor I had worked with professionally who believed, as I did, that Midtown Atlanta was sitting on the edge of a sustained appreciation cycle. Marcus was 44, a former engineer who had transitioned into property investment in his 30s, and he was looking for a younger partner with market analysis skills and the appetite to take on a property with development potential. I had done the analysis on a 12-story mixed-use building on Peachtree and 6th that had been significantly undervalued due to deferred maintenance and a previous management structure that had driven out commercial tenants. I brought Marcus the numbers. He brought additional capital. We structured a partnership agreement, each held 49%, and a small 2% share went to the attorney who facilitated the deal. We closed on the Peachtree property when I was 27 years old. I was 6 months into dating Derek at the time. I didn't tell him about it for another 8 months, and when I did, his reaction told me something important that I filed away without fully examining until much later. He smiled, said that was impressive, asked a few surface-level questions about the partnership structure, and then pivoted to talking about a financial advisory account he was trying to acquire. He never asked to see the documents. He never asked about my equity stake or my plans for the property. He moved past it the way people move past information that doesn't fit into the story they're already telling themselves. The story Derek was telling himself, I came to understand, was that he was the financially sophisticated one in our relationship. That my work was competent but secondary. That my accomplishments were the respectable backdrop to his ambitions, not ambitions of their own. We got engaged when I was 27 and a half, married at 27 and 10 months, in a ceremony at a venue in Decatur that we split the cost of. Though Constance spent the entire planning process making suggestions about a different venue, one her friends would have recognized, that was 30% more expensive and that she had no intention of contributing to. When I said politely that the Decatur venue worked beautifully for our budget, she looked at me with a patience that suggested she was explaining something basic to someone who lacked the context to understand it. I had a property worth over $7 million at the time. I said nothing about it. The 4 years of marriage were not a dramatic catastrophe. There was no single explosion. It was subtler and, in many ways, more corrosive. The slow, consistent draining of a woman's sense of her own reality by people who were counting on her to stay confused. Derek was not a screamer. He was a minimizer. When something bothered me, he had a gift for making the problem seem smaller, and my response to it seemed disproportionate. And he did it with such casual certainty that I spent the first 2 years genuinely questioning whether I was the unreasonable one. He never said you're crazy. He said things like, I just think you're reading into it. Or, I feel like you're making this about something it's not. Or simply, my mother didn't mean it that way, Serena. Constance didn't mean it the time she mentioned, in front of 4 people at Thanksgiving, that she had always hoped Derek would find a partner who could give him a certain kind of home environment, and then looked at my hands when she said it. Constance didn't mean it the time she asked. At Christmas, whether I was planning to do something with my hair before a family photo, and when I raised an eyebrow, she said she was just asking because she knew women like me sometimes had trouble with the humidity. Constance didn't mean it the time she asked Derek, within my earshot, whether he had thought about what kind of neighborhood they might look at if he and I ever decided to upgrade from our current place. Our current place was a 1,400-square-foot apartment in Virginia Highland that we rented together. A decision I had made deliberately, because I had no intention of putting my husband's name on anything I owned until I understood clearly who he was. Something in me, some early instinct trained by years of watching my mother work and watching money disappear when people weren't careful, had kept that line intact. My personal assets, my property interests, my accounts, separate. Joint account for household expenses, each contributing proportionally to income. Everything else, mine. Derek had never objected, because he understood the logic, or so he said. What he didn't say, and what I pieced together over 4 years of watching him, was that he assumed my separate assets were modest. He thought my 49% stake in a mixed-use commercial property was something more like a side investment, a partial interest in some middling rental unit, competently managed but not significant. He had no idea what the Peachtree building was actually worth because he had never asked, and I had never volunteered, and his assumption of my modest ambitions protected him from having to confront the reality of what I had built. Constance's assumption was even simpler. She didn't think I had built anything. She had seen where I came from. She had made her calculation. Women like me, in her architecture of the world, were fine as additions to a household. We worked, we were capable, we were not embarrassing, but we were not people who owned significant things. We were not people who needed to be taken seriously in conversations about money or property or the kind of life her son deserved. We were guests in rooms that other people owned. The apartment in Virginia Highland was rented. That part was true. What Constance didn't know was that the Peachtree building, which she had moved into 18 months into our marriage, had also been mine, or mostly mine, the entire time. Let me explain how that happened, because it matters. Approximately 14 months after our wedding, Marcus Webb called me to discuss a potential restructuring of our partnership. He was 62 and had been diagnosed with a degenerative joint condition that was going to require significant time and energy over the next few years, and he wanted to simplify his portfolio. He offered to sell me his 49% stake at a price that reflected the partnership's original terms, a number that, given the property's appreciation, was genuinely fair to him and genuinely advantageous to me. I had the liquidity to do it. Years of disciplined saving, plus equity refinancing on the original purchase, plus the rental income that had been building in the property's account since we acquired it. It worked. I bought Marcus out. The 2% attorney share was also restructured at that point, and by the end of the transaction, I held 98% of the Peachtree property outright, with a small retained interest going to the facilitating attorney who had negotiated the buyout terms. I was 29 years old. I owned a 12-story building in Midtown Atlanta. My name was the owner of record. I had a property management company handle the day-to-day operations because I had a full-time career and no interest in fielding maintenance calls. And for the 18 months since the buyout, the building had simply existed as one of my assets, present in my financial statements, managed professionally, generating income that went into accounts in my name. And then Constance had called Derek to say she was thinking about moving into a building she'd heard about in Midtown on Peachtree and 6th, a beautiful place with a wine bar on the ground floor and a rooftop terrace. And did he know anything about the availability of units there? I was in the kitchen when he told me, and I remember very clearly the quality of the pause I let happen before I responded, not because I was surprised exactly, but because I needed a moment to process what I was going to do with this particular situation. I could have said at that moment that the building belonged to me. I could have said, actually, let me check on availability because I have some influence there, said with a smile, and let the implication land. I did not. I said that sounded lovely and that the building had a very good reputation, and I asked if she had been in touch with the leasing office. Derek said she was going to call. I nodded and went back to making dinner. Constance moved into Unit 9C of the Peachtree building on a Thursday in March 18 months ago. She signed a lease with the property management company. She sent Derek photos of the terrace and the view. She called me, one of the rare occasions she called me directly, to say that she was very settled and very pleased, and that the building was truly a different level from what most people in Atlanta had access to. I said that it sounded wonderful. She said it really was. There was something in her voice that I recognized, a satisfaction that had an edge of comparison to it, the particular pleasure of having something she suspected others didn't. I thanked her for calling and went back to my evening. For 18 months, I paid the property management company to manage a building whose current tenants included my mother-in-law, who did not know I owned it. She paid her rent on time. I will give her that. $100 a month for a 2-bedroom unit with a city view. I saw the records every month. I signed off on maintenance requests. I approved the new commercial lease negotiations for the ground floor retail space. And then came that Tuesday evening, and the manila envelope on the counter and the need for the owner's signature on finalized commercial lease documents, and the call I got from the property management company asking if I could come in on Friday morning because they needed me in person for the notarized signature on the new agreements. That part was routine. What was not routine was what happened in the 48 hours between that phone call and Friday morning, and the way Constance Callahan managed to be present. Deliberately, I believe, because Derek had mentioned my appointment and she had asked to meet me there, saying she wanted to check on something with her own unit. When I walked into the building's management office on the 9th floor, I should have known she had something prepared. In 5 years of knowing her, Constance had never passed up an opportunity to establish the terms of an encounter before it began. She had a talent for it, for positioning herself as the authority in a room before anyone else had finished sitting down. And she had chosen this room, this day, with a specific intention that I would only fully understand when the words came out of her mouth. I arrived at the building at 9:45 in the morning on that Friday. I was dressed in a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, dark tailored trousers, and my good shoes. The kind of outfit I wore to professional meetings where I needed to be taken seriously, which was, as it happened, exactly what this was. I had the manila envelope in my bag. I had my identification. I had my copy of the ownership documents that the management company would need to cross-reference with the lease filing. I did not expect Constance to be in the lobby. She was standing near the building's main reception desk when I came through the glass doors, wearing one of her church-adjacent outfits, a pale lavender suit jacket, heels that suggested an occasion, pearl earrings. She was talking to a woman I didn't recognize, her posture carrying the particular erectness she deployed when she wanted to signal that she belonged somewhere in a way that others might not. She saw me come in, and her expression shifted into the version of her smile that was mostly composed of evaluation. "Good morning, Serena," she said. She said it the way you say good morning to someone who is slightly late to something that has already started without them. "Good morning, Constance," I said. I kept my voice easy and warm, the way I had learned to do over 5 years of these encounters. She turned slightly away from the woman she'd been talking to and stepped toward me. And then she did something I hadn't quite anticipated. She gestured around the lobby with a small, proprietary sweep of her hand, the way a person gestures toward a space they consider theirs in some meaningful way. "Beautiful building, isn't it?" she said. "I'm sure it must be quite something to see the kind of places Derek's family has access to." I absorbed that sentence. I let it sit for exactly 1 second. "It's a wonderful property," I said. She tilted her head slightly. "Are you here to visit?" she asked, and the word visit carried a specific weight, the suggestion of someone who had come to observe rather than to belong. "I'm here for a meeting," I said. She looked at me with that look, the one that had been assembled over 5 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings and phone calls, where she addressed Derek directly about things that concerned me. The look of a woman who had decided she already understood the situation. "With the management staff?" she said. "How nice. I have such a good relationship with the people here. I should introduce you." And then she said it. She said it looking directly at me in a voice that was not raised or ugly, that was, in fact, perfectly pleasant, which made it worse. She said, "You know, people like you don't really get to experience a place like this very often. Enjoy the visit, Serena. It's probably the last time you'll ever get to come inside a building like this." The lobby had that quality of space that absorbs sound a little, high ceilings, stone floors, the muffled ambient noise of a building going about its business. I heard what she said with complete clarity. I want to tell you that I felt rage in that moment. I want to tell you that something in my chest went hot and sharp, and some of that is true. There was a heat in me, the kind that comes from 5 years of accumulated patience finally touching something it could not absorb. But there was also something else, something colder and more precise. Because I had lived in that building for 18 months as its owner without Constance knowing, and I had walked into that lobby with a manila envelope that was going to make everything very clear in a matter of minutes. And what I felt, underneath the heat, was something very close to stillness. I looked at her. I kept my face composed. I said, "Thank you, Constance." And then the elevator doors opened, and Gregory Tate, the property manager who had worked with my management company for 3 years, came across the lobby with his hand already extended and a professional smile on his face, the kind of smile you give the person you've been waiting for. He walked directly to me. Ms. Watkins Callahan, he said, thank you for coming in. We have everything ready upstairs. I just need a few minutes of your time and your signature on the final commercial lease documents. He reached into the folder he was carrying and held out the papers. Ma'am, he said, looking at me, I need the owner's signature right here, and he indicated the line at the bottom of the first document. I took the papers. I was aware, in the peripheral way you become aware of everything in certain moments, of Constance Callahan standing approximately 4 feet to my left. I heard the pause, the particular quality of it, the way the air in that lobby seemed to compress slightly. And then I heard her voice, and it was not the composed church-adjacent voice she had been using. It was something thinner, something that had lost its scaffolding. The owner, she said. She was looking at Gregory Tate when she said it, as if he might correct some misunderstanding. He glanced at her with professional courtesy. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Watkins Callahan is the owner of record of this property. Has been since the building was acquired through partnership and then held outright after the buyout was completed. He said it plainly, with the mild precision of someone stating a fact that was simply part of the record. Constance looked at the papers in my hands. Then she looked at me. She had gone pale. Not dramatically, not like a scene in a film, but in the specific way of a person whose internal architecture has just been load-bearing a belief that turned out not to be structural. The color left her face in a quiet, practical way. Her pearl earrings caught the lobby light. Her hands, I noticed, had stopped their usual slight motion. You? She said. Her voice was barely at full volume. I looked at her for a moment. Not with triumph, not with performance, just with the calm of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment to arrive, and feels in its arrival neither surprise nor vengeance, but something more like completion. Yes, I said. Me. Then I turned back to Gregory Tate and said, let's go upstairs and finish the paperwork. We went up in the elevator. I could feel her presence in the lobby below us, the way you feel certain things without looking. A pressure, a shift in the weight of a space. I did not look back. I had 5 years of practice at not looking back in ways that served Constance's narrative, and this particular not looking back was the most intentional of all of them. Gregory's office on the 9th floor was clean and well organized, with a window that faced the building's east side and caught the morning light in a way I had always found pleasant when I had been up there for previous meetings. He set out the documents with the efficiency of someone who was good at his job. I reviewed each page with the attention I gave every document that carried my signature, and he waited without rushing me because he understood that this was how I operated. While I was reviewing, he asked, conversationally, whether I knew the woman in the lobby. She's my mother-in-law, I said. He nodded slowly. He didn't say anything further about it, which I appreciated. He was professional in the way I valued most. Present and capable without being intrusive. I signed the documents. I initialed the relevant pages. He made copies for the file and gave me the originals in a fresh envelope. We discussed the commercial tenants briefly. The wine bar's lease renewal was the largest of the agreements, and we talked through the terms for 3 or 4 minutes. Then I put the envelope in my bag, thanked him, and took the elevator back down. Constance was still in the lobby. I had not expected that. I had expected her to leave, to go upstairs to her unit, to collect herself, to call Derek and begin the version of events that would reconstitute the story in her favor. Instead, she was standing near one of the chairs by the reception area, and when I came off the elevator, she turned and looked at me with an expression I didn't have a precise word for. It was not apology exactly. It was not anger. It was something more like a person who has been handed information they cannot immediately process and hasn't yet decided what to do with it. I walked toward the exit. She took a step in my direction. Serena, she said. I paused. I gave her that. I paused, and I turned. I didn't know, she said. I let that sit for a moment. I know you didn't, I said. There was a beat of silence. The stone floors carried the ambient sound of the building, elevator machinery, distant traffic through the glass, the faint hum of climate control. How long? She asked. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. Since I was 27, I said. I acquired it in partnership originally. I bought out my partner 2 years ago. She absorbed that. 27 was the year I met her son. She was doing the arithmetic. I could see it. You never said anything, she said. No, I said. I didn't. And I didn't elaborate, because the elaboration was implicit, and she was intelligent enough to hear it. I had never said anything, because there had never been a conversation in which the information would have been received as information rather than immediately restructured into something that served her existing picture of me. I had kept it because keeping it was my right, because my assets were my assets, because the building was mine before Derek, before the marriage, before 5 years of Sunday dinners where my worth was assessed and found circumstantially acceptable. I did not say any of this. I didn't need to. I said, "Have a good morning, Constance." Then I went through the glass doors and out onto Peachtree Street, and the Atlanta morning air was already carrying the particular warmth of a Georgia spring, and I walked to where I had parked without looking back. I called my attorney from the car, not because anything that had happened that morning required immediate legal attention, but because I had been thinking for several months about a conversation I needed to have about the future of my marriage, and the Friday morning at the Peachtree Building had clarified something I had been turning over for longer than I wanted to admit. What I had seen in Constance's face in that lobby, not just the shock of the revelation, but the completeness of her miscalculation, the depth of what she had not known, was a mirror for something I needed to look at more directly. If Constance had built 5 years of contempt on a foundation of assumptions that were entirely wrong, what did that say about what she had been telling Derek? And what did that say about what Derek had been believing, or choosing to believe, about what I was and what I was worth? My attorney was a woman named Patricia Hargrove, who practiced family and asset law out of an office in Buckhead. I had consulted with her once before, about 2 years into the marriage, in what had been a preliminary and exploratory conversation, the kind of conversation a careful person has when they begin to sense that the story they're living may be heading somewhere they want to be prepared for. Patricia was 53, meticulous, and had the specific energy of a woman who had spent decades watching people underestimate the seriousness of documentation, with predictable consequences for those people. I told her what had happened that morning, not the lobby scene. I gave her the broader picture. The 5 years, the pattern, the accumulation of small dismissals that had functioned, taken together, as a sustained effort to diminish my self-perception. Derek's specific contributions to that effort. The way financial decisions within our marriage had been shaped by his assumption that my assets were modest and my ambitions secondary. The way our joint account had been managed with a casualness that had cost me more than I was comfortable with. Money moved or committed to expenses related to his business without the conversation that should have preceded them. Patricia listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I valued most about her. Then she said, "Tell me about your current asset structure." So I told her. The Peachtree Building. Its current appraised value, which had been assessed at $8.2 million in the most recent independent appraisal conducted 14 months ago. My separate investment accounts. The equity I held independently. The joint account and what was in it. The nature of our lease on the Virginia Highland apartment, which was in my name because I had been the one with the better credit score when we applied. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And your husband has no ownership interest in the Peachtree property?" "None," I said. "It was acquired before the marriage, maintained in my name, and the buyout of my former partner was financed entirely through my own assets. There is no joint interest, no marital contribution, and no commingling that would create a claim." She said, "And he was aware of the property?" "I told him it existed," I said. "He knew I had a partnership interest in a commercial property. He never asked for documentation, never reviewed the assets, and I never provided specifics beyond the general disclosure." She wrote something. I could hear the pen. "And the mother-in-law's residency in the building?" she asked. "Coincidental," I said. "She found it independently, signed a standard lease. She has no knowledge of my ownership interest." "Had no knowledge," Patricia said, correcting my tense accurately. "Had no knowledge until today," I said. There was a brief pause. Patricia said, "Serena, I think we should schedule an in-person meeting. There are some things I want to walk through with you about your options and your exposure, given everything you've described." I said, "I think so too. Can you do Monday morning?" She could. I drove home from the car park thinking about 4 years of marriage and the person I had been when I entered it. I had been competent, prepared, and carefully organized. I had also been 27 and in love with a man who was charming and confident and who had made me feel in the beginning, like I was someone he recognized across a crowded room. Not because I was useful to his narrative, but because he actually saw me. I had believed that for longer than I should have, which is not a character flaw so much as a human one. We want to be seen, and the people who understand that particular want can do a lot of damage while it persists. What Derek had done over 4 years was not see me, or more precisely, he had seen a version of me that was comprehensible within the story he was telling himself, and anything I did or said or owned that didn't fit that version simply didn't register. The property on Peachtree and 6th hadn't registered. My professional standing hadn't registered in the way it should have. My financial independence hadn't registered as the genuine, significant, self-constructed reality that it was. It had registered as background. Admirable background, perhaps, but background. And his mother's contempt had been the daily maintenance of a belief system that Derek had never chosen to challenge, because challenging it would have required him to see me differently. And seeing me differently would have meant revising the story. And revising the story was, for Derek, apparently more effortful than I was worth. That was the part I had taken the longest to fully accept. When I got home that Friday afternoon, Derek was already there. He worked from home on Fridays, a habit from the pandemic that had simply continued. He was at the kitchen island with his laptop and a cup of coffee, and he looked up when I came in with the particular expression of a man who had already been briefed. Constance had called him. Of course she had. She had called him the moment she left the lobby, or possibly from the elevator, or possibly from a bench on Peachtree Street while she was still processing what had happened. I didn't know the exact timing, but I knew she had called. Because Derek's face when he looked at me was not his normal Friday afternoon face. It was the face of a man who had received information that had rearranged something and hadn't yet decided how to present his rearrangement. He said, "My mom called me." I set my bag on the chair by the door and said, "I thought she might." He said, "She said you own the building?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. I could hear the refrigerator running, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the quality of a silence that has weight in it. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, and I thought very carefully about how to answer that, because the honest answer was layered in a way that a Friday afternoon conversation was not going to fully contain, and because the question itself was interesting. Not "why didn't you tell me earlier?" or "how did you manage the acquisition?" or "what does this mean for us?" but "why didn't you tell me?" with the emphasis of a person who felt he should have been told, as if my asset was information I owed him rather than a reality I had built. "Because it was mine," I said. I said it simply, without heat. He looked at me. "I've been your husband for 4 years, Serena," he said. "Yes," I said. The silence between us had a different texture now. Not the ordinary silence of two people sharing a kitchen, but the silence of a conversation that both of us understood had implications we hadn't fully spoken yet. He said, "My mom is really upset." I said, "I imagine she is." He said, "She didn't. She didn't know. She said some things in the lobby and I know what she said. I told him. I was there." Another pause. "She said she's embarrassed," he offered. His voice had that specific tone of a person asking you to do something without quite asking it. To smooth, to absorb, to make the discomfort smaller. I looked at him across the kitchen island. "Derek," I said, "your mother told me, in the lobby of a building I own, that people like me don't deserve to be in a place like that, and that I should enjoy the visit because it would be the last time I'd ever get inside a building of that caliber. She said that to me in front of the property manager and a woman I had never met, in the lobby of a property whose lease documents I was there to sign as the owner of record." He was quiet. "She said things like that to me for 5 years," I said, "in front of you, in front of your family, at your family's dinner table. And you have spent 5 years telling me she didn't mean it that way." His jaw was tight. I didn't know she was saying things that seriously bothered you, Serena." I let that sentence land, and then I let it sit there between us without rescuing it. Because there was nothing I could add to it that would make it more honest than it already was in its wrongness. He hadn't known because he hadn't wanted to know, and not wanting to know is a choice people make repeatedly, in small ways, until the accumulation becomes the truth of who they are. I picked up my water glass and I said, "I have a meeting with my attorney Monday morning." And I went to my office and I closed the door. The weekend was quiet in the specific way of a shared space where something has broken and both people are waiting to see what it looks like when it finishes falling. Derek cooked dinner on Saturday night, which he rarely did, and we ate at the table without the television on, which we also rarely did, and we talked about things that were not what we were thinking about. A friend's wedding coming up, something he'd read about the Braves, the weather. It was the performance of normalcy between two people who both understood that something was ending, even if neither of them had used that word yet. Sunday he went to his mother's. He came back in the evening looking like a man who had spent the day being spoken to at length, and I knew, without asking, that Constance had not spent the day telling him that she had been wrong for 5 years. I knew because I knew her, and I knew because the particular set of his expression when he came back was the expression of a man who had been reinforced in his discomfort rather than redirected. He sat across from me in the living room. "My mom wants to apologize," he said. "Okay," I said. "She's wondering if we could have lunch this week," he said. "I'll think about it," I said. He said, "Serena?" And then he stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment. He said, "I just want to understand what's happening here." "What's happening," I said, "is that I'm meeting with my attorney Monday morning. That's what I told you Friday. I'm meeting with her Monday morning, and then I'll have a clearer picture of what comes next." He looked up. "Your attorney," he said. "For what?" I looked at him steadily. "To understand my options," I said. The silence this time was of a different quality entirely. The silence of a word like options landing in a marriage and opening up a space that hasn't been there before, or that's been there but unacknowledged, and now is present and cannot be made absent again. "Are you talking about," he said, and didn't finish the sentence. "I'm talking about meeting with my attorney on Monday morning," I said, "and I'd like to go to bed." I went to the bedroom and I lay in the dark for a while, not sleeping, listening to the sounds of the apartment, Derek moving in the living room, the building's HVAC cycling the street below. I thought about the Peachtree building and its 12 floors and its rooftop terrace and the wine bar on the ground floor that had just signed a new 3-year lease at an improved rate. I thought about my mother, who had cleaned office buildings for 22 years so that I could go to Georgia State and get an education she hadn't had, and who had cried at my wedding with the specific joy of a woman who believed she was watching her daughter arrive somewhere safe. I thought about what safe had turned out to mean. Monday morning, Patricia Hargrove's Buckhead office had the particular quiet of a well-run professional space. Clean surfaces, good light, the sound of air conditioning doing its job without announcing itself. She was already at her desk when I arrived at 9, with coffee for both of us and a legal pad, and the expression of a woman who had read my file over the weekend. She asked me to walk her through the financial picture of the marriage in detail, which I did. Joint account. Current balance approximately $34,000. Monthly contributions. Mine had averaged $6,200. Derek's had averaged $5,100, with several months in the past year where his contribution had been lower due to what he described as irregular commission cycles. Joint account expenditures over the past 18 months that I had flagged. 3 charges from a restaurant in Virginia Highland that I didn't recognize, 2 transfers to a Venmo account that wasn't mine and wasn't a vendor I was aware of. 1 charge from a travel booking site on a date when Derek had told me he was in Charlotte for a client meeting. Patricia looked at the list I'd prepared. "How long have you been keeping track of these?" she said. "About 14 months, I said. "Do you have documentation? Statements? Screenshots?" "Every statement for the past 2 years, I said. I pulled them from the online banking portal and saved them to a folder. Screenshots of specific transactions I flagged. I've kept them in a personal cloud account. She made a note. She said, "The Venmo account, do you know whose it is?" I had an idea. I had looked up the username when I first noticed the transfer 14 months ago, and it was associated with a profile photo that I had seen in a tagged photo on a mutual friend's Instagram. A woman named Brittany, who worked in Derek's professional network in a capacity I had never fully understood, because Derek had described her variously as a colleague, a contractor, and once, when I asked directly after seeing her name in his phone, as just someone from the industry who was helpful on certain accounts. He had said the last one with a specific ease that I had recognized, because I had been watching people use that particular ease when they were managing information for a long time. I described this to Patricia. She wrote for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "And the restaurant charges?" The restaurant was a place in Virginia Highland called Osteria Mara. I had never been there with Derek. It was the kind of place, not expensive, but chosen, wine-forward, the kind of place people go deliberately. He'd been charged there 3 times in 14 months, each time on a Tuesday evening when he had said he was working late. Patricia's pen paused on the pad. She said, "Serena, let me ask you something directly." I said, "Please." She said, "Are you here today because of what happened Friday at the building, or were you already planning to come to me?" I had been thinking about this question because I knew she would ask it. "I was already planning to come," I said. Friday accelerated the timeline. She nodded. "Why did Friday accelerate it?" "Because," I said, "watching my mother-in-law stand in the lobby of my building and tell me that people like me don't belong in places like that, and then realizing that she believed it completely, and that she believed it in part because her son had spent 4 years allowing her to believe it, told me something about the architecture of what I'd been living in that I didn't want to spend any more time in." Patricia looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. "Good answer," she said. Then she turned the legal pad to a fresh page and said, "Let's talk about what you're entitled to and what we need to document before you initiate anything." The next 3 weeks were the most organized and deliberate weeks of my adult life, which is saying something. Patricia referred me to a forensic accountant named Douglas Chin, who worked out of an office in Dunwoody and who had the specific gift of looking at financial records the way radiologists look at scans, identifying patterns that the untrained eye would skip over. He pulled 2 years of Derek's individual financial records through the discovery process Patricia had initiated with a formal legal letter, which Derek's own hastily retained attorney could not block entirely because the process was standard and Patricia had filed it correctly. What Douglas found was not a criminal conspiracy. It was something more mundane and, in some ways, more familiar. The financial behavior of a man who had been conducting a parallel social life that he was financing in small, plausibly deniable amounts. The Venmo transfers to Brittany's account totaled $4,800 over 16 months. 3 of those transfers had occurred in the same weeks as the Osteria Mara charges. The Charlotte trip that had produced a receipt, Douglas found it, was charged to a hotel in Charlotte, but the hotel had a second guest listed on the room, a detail that appeared in the itemized folio that Derek had submitted for a business expense reimbursement from his firm, which meant his employer's accounting records also contained it. He had submitted a hotel bill with a double occupancy charge as a reimbursable business expense. His firm, when contacted through proper channels by Patricia's office in the context of a formal legal inquiry, confirmed that the expense had been approved without the double occupancy detail being flagged. Douglas also found something I had not expected. A personal savings account in Derek's name alone, not a joint account, not connected to anything I had access to, that had been opened approximately 22 months earlier, and into which he had been making regular deposits of between $300 and $800 a month. The account held $19,400. Patricia called me when she received Douglas's report. She said, "I want to walk you through everything, but I want to say first that you were very well prepared. The documentation you brought to our first meeting made Douglas's work significantly cleaner." I said, "Thank you." She said, "The parallel account is the most significant piece for the divorce proceedings because it represents a deliberate concealment of marital assets. Georgia is an equitable distribution state, which means the court considers what's fair, and concealment of assets is not fair, which means it tends to influence the settlement conversation in your direction." I said, "And the property management account for the Peachtree building? Is there any exposure there?" She said, "The building is clean. Premarital asset, no marital contribution, no commingling. It's yours completely and the divorce proceedings will confirm that." I said, "Good." She said, "I want to schedule a formal mediation session with Derek and his attorney. Are you ready for that?" I thought about it for about 4 seconds. "Yes," I said. The mediation was held 3 weeks later in a conference room at a neutral law firm in downtown Atlanta. It was a Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock, with the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and a mediator named Gerald Fontaine, who was 61 and wore reading glasses on a chain and had the kind of measured neutrality that comes from decades of sitting in rooms where people are trying to determine the price of what they built together. Derek came with his attorney, a man named Parker, who had the look of someone who had been given less to work with than he had hoped. Derek himself looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not dramatically diminished, but like a person who had been having a lot of difficult conversations over a compressed period of time and was beginning to understand that the difficult conversations were not going to resolve in his favor. He looked at me across the conference table, and I looked back. And for a moment, I thought about the man I had believed he was when I was 26, and he was looking at me across a crowded professional event in Buckhead, as if I were the most interesting person in the room. That man had existed. Or something close to him had existed. What hadn't existed was the version of our future that man had seemed to promise. Patricia laid out the settlement terms she was proposing, and she walked through each one with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times and understood that precision, more than volume, is what makes walls come down. The Peachtree Building, entirely mine. Premarital acquisition, zero marital interest, non-negotiable. His attorney made a brief comment about the length of the marriage and the potential for a contribution argument. Patricia put Douglas's documentation on the table, the timeline of acquisition, the buyout structure, the financing sources, and said, "We are prepared to demonstrate in detail that no marital funds or labor contributed to the acquisition, maintenance, or appreciation of this asset. If you'd like to proceed on a contribution theory, we're ready to litigate it." Parker looked at the documentation and wrote something on his pad and did not raise the point again. The joint account to be divided equally, with the exception of the portion equivalent to the Venmo transfers and the hotel folio discrepancy, which Patricia argued represented unilateral dissipation of marital assets. The equivalent amount to be credited to my share of the distribution. The hidden savings account, disclosed in discovery, subject to division as a marital asset. Derek had not disclosed it in his initial financial affidavit, which Patricia noted explicitly for the record in a way that made Gerald Fontaine write something carefully on his own pad. The Virginia Highland Apartment, lease in my name. I would continue it if I chose to. Derek would need to make other arrangements within 30 days of the agreement being signed. His car, his. My car, mine, paid in full in my name. Professional assets, Derek's client book was his. My professional standing and the relationships I had built through my firm and through the Peachtree property were mine. Derek was quiet through most of it. His attorney raised objections on 2 points, the hidden account treatment and the dissipation credit. And Patricia responded to each with documentation and a calmness that I found genuinely impressive. By 11:30 in the morning, his attorney asked for a 15-minute break. Derek and I sat in the conference room while the attorney stepped out. Gerald Fontaine excused himself briefly as well, and for a few minutes it was just the two of us and the Atlanta skyline and the sound of the building's ventilation system. Derek looked at me. He said, "Serena." I waited. He said, "I want to say..." He stopped, ran a hand over his face. He said, I know things weren't what I told you they were." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry." I looked at him. I believed him, actually. Not completely, and not in the way that changes anything. But I believed that in that conference room, at that moment, he was experiencing something genuinely like regret. I didn't think it was regret about who he had been, so much as regret about where that had brought him. But I was not going to sort that out for him, and I was not going to offer anything in exchange for it. I said, "Okay." He said, I don't think I ever really..." He stopped again, looking for words that would make the thing smaller or simpler, or at least more survivable to say aloud. I said, "Derek, I don't need you to explain it to me." He looked at me, and for a moment something moved across his face that looked like the beginning of something real. And then the attorneys came back in, and we returned to the table, and 45 minutes later we had a signed mediation agreement that both attorneys would carry into a final divorce filing. I walked out of that building at 12:47 in the afternoon, into a Tuesday that was warm and bright in the specific way Atlanta manages in late spring. The azaleas already past their peak, but still present. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the air move around me. Patricia came out behind me and shook my hand and said, "You did very well in there." I said, "Thank you for getting me ready." She said, "I want to follow up with you in 2 weeks about the final filing, and we should talk about the property management structure as you're moving forward as a single owner of record." I said, "Absolutely. Let's schedule it." She went to her car. I went to mine. I sat in the driver's seat for a minute without starting the engine. I thought about Constance Callahan standing in the lobby of the Peachtree Building 17 days earlier, looking at me with the certainty of a woman who has never once reconsidered her first impressions, telling me that people like me don't get to be in places like this. I thought about what people like me had turned out to be. The divorce was finalized 11 weeks later in a Fulton County courtroom by a judge who reviewed the mediation agreement and found it equitable and signed the final decree on a Wednesday afternoon with the procedural efficiency of someone who had done this several thousand times. I was present. Derek was present. Our attorneys were present. The judge was not particularly interested in the story behind the documents. She was interested in whether the documents reflected a fair agreement, which they did because Patricia had made sure of it. I walked out of the Fulton County Courthouse on a Wednesday afternoon, and I was 32 years old, and I was no longer anyone's wife. And the Peachtree Building on the corner of Peachtree and 6th in Midtown Atlanta still had my name on the ownership documents and was generating rental income into accounts in my name, and had just completed the 3rd month of the wine bar's new lease at an improved rate. I drove back to Virginia Highland. The apartment felt different. It had been feeling different since Derek had moved out 6 weeks earlier, his departure quiet and organized, the way he did most things. He had taken his clothes, his books, his good kitchen knives, a print we'd bought at an art fair 2 years into the marriage. He had left his coffee maker because he knew I used it more than he did, which was, in the final accounting of 4 years, a small and accurate piece of knowledge to have gathered. I sat in the kitchen that Wednesday evening, and I had a glass of wine, and I thought about what came next, which was not an abstract question, but a practical one. I had my job at the firm. I had the Peachtree property. I had a forensic accountant who had now seen my financial picture in granular detail, and who had told me, not in a professional, but in a personal aside, as we were wrapping up the final documentation, that I had built something genuinely impressive, and that I should be protective of it going forward. I had Patricia's number. I had my mother, who had cried again when I told her. Differently from the way she'd cried at the wedding, but not without love in it. I had the apartment, temporarily. I had been looking at properties, because the Virginia Highland apartment was the right size for a life organized around another person's presence. And I was reorganizing now, and what I needed was something that was entirely shaped by what I actually required. I found it 2 months later, a loft in Inman Park, 1,200 square feet, top floor of a converted Victorian building on Euclid Avenue, with original hardwood floors and a kitchen that had good southern light in the mornings, and a window in the main room that I could put a chair in front of and read. It was mine. The lease was mine. Nothing in it was structured around someone else's preferences or someone else's idea of what I needed. I moved in on a Saturday in September with the help of my friend Keandra, who had been my closest friend since our 2nd year at Georgia State, and who had watched the entire marriage with the restrained concern of a person who knew better than to say, "I told you so," while you're still in it, and who also knew when the time for restraint was over. She showed up with her truck and 2 strong cousins and a bottle of Prosecco for after, and we moved every box and piece of furniture in 4 hours. And then we sat on the floor of the new living room and drank the Prosecco out of paper cups because the glasses were still packed, and Keandra said, "Welcome back to yourself." I laughed. I actually laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere real, not the social laugh I had become accustomed to performing in rooms where I was always slightly managing something. "Welcome back," I said. "I want to tell you what happened to Constance, because it matters, and because it did not go the way she had planned. In the weeks following the lobby incident, after it became clear that the mediation was proceeding, after Derek moved out, after the social fabric of their carefully maintained family narrative began to show the shape of what had actually been holding it together. Constance called me twice. I did not answer either time. She left a voicemail on the first call that began with the words Serena in a tone I had never heard from her, uncertain, slightly smaller than her usual register, and said that she wanted to talk, that she had been thinking, that perhaps she had not always been as fair as she should have been, The voicemail lasted 48 seconds. I listened to it once, saved it to my personal records file, and did not return the call. The second call, she did not leave a message. What I learned through the ordinary channels of shared connections over the following months was this. Constance's lease at the Peachtree Building came up for renewal in March, 8 months after the lobby incident. The property management company sent her a renewal offer, as they did for all tenants approaching the end of their lease term. The renewal rate for her unit, a 2-bedroom with a city view on the 9th floor, had been adjusted to $3,400 per month, reflecting a market rate increase that was consistent with what the building had applied across all residential units in the same period. She renewed. She signed the new lease, and she stayed in Unit 9C, in a building that belonged to me, because the unit was genuinely excellent and the location was genuinely excellent. And Midtown Atlanta in that corridor had appreciated significantly enough that the alternatives at a comparable standard were not meaningfully cheaper. Every month, her rent payment came in through the property management company's system and was logged in the building's income records and eventually appeared in my quarterly. Financial summary. I reviewed those summaries the way I reviewed all my financial documents, carefully at my kitchen table with coffee on Sunday mornings. Her name appeared in the tenant roster under Callahan C, Unit 9C. Lease term, current. Payment status, current. I noted it every quarter. I felt, reviewing it, something I could only describe as the particular satisfaction of precision. Not cruelty, not revenge, but the accurate outcome of things being exactly what they had always been, now fully visible. What I learned about Brittany came through Douglas Chin's report and through a mutual professional contact who mentioned it as neutral information with no particular drama attached to it. She and Derek had, by the time the divorce was finalized, apparently reduced the frequency of their arrangement considerably, in the specific way that arrangements built on parallel secrecy tend to lose their appeal when the secrecy is gone and the full cost of the parallel becomes visible. I do not know the details of what happened between them, and I have no interest in knowing. What I know is that Derek had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Brookhaven. Smaller than what we'd shared, certainly smaller than the life he had been imagining, and that his professional standing had been affected in a modest but real way by the expense report issue, which his firm had addressed internally in a manner that had been explained to me only as resulting in a formal performance review. He had not lost his job, but he had been seen differently by people who made decisions about his future there, and being seen differently by those people had consequences that would take years to fully work through. I did not feel pleasure about that. I felt the appropriate absence of surprise. By the time the year turned and I had been living in the Inman Park loft for 4 months, the life I was building had a texture that I kept trying to find the right word for and kept arriving at the same one. Mine. Entirely mine, shaped by my schedule, my preferences, my financial reality, my relationships. I got up early because I had always been an early riser, and there was no longer any friction about the alarm. I cooked the food I actually wanted to eat, which tended toward the kind of home cooking my mother had taught me, and that Derek had politely tolerated while occasionally suggesting restaurants. I went to the Inman Park Farmers Market on Saturday mornings and walked home with too many vegetables and spent the afternoon doing something with them while listening to whatever I wanted to listen to. I walked to the Peachtree Building on a Tuesday in November for a quarterly review meeting with Gregory Tate and the management team. It was a cool morning, Atlanta's version of November, which is real enough to require a coat without being severe. And I walked the 40 minutes because I wanted the air and the movement. I went through the glass doors of the lobby, and Gregory met me near the reception desk and shook my hand, and we went up in the elevator to the 9th floor. And as we passed the hallway leading to Unit 9C, I kept my eyes forward and my expression neutral and felt nothing in particular. In the conference room, Gregory walked me through the quarterly numbers. Occupancy rate 94%. Wine bar performing ahead of lease projections for the first quarter of the new agreement. 2 maintenance items pending, both minor. A conversation he wanted to have about a potential capital improvement to the rooftop terrace that would position the building well against competing inventory in the area. I listened. I asked the questions I always asked. I reviewed the documentation he had prepared. We discussed the capital improvement, and I told him to get me 3 contractor bids and we'd make a decision in Q1. He made notes. We finished in 40 minutes. On the way out, in the elevator, Gregory said, "I hope the rest of your day is good." I said, "Thank you, Gregory. You too." The lobby was quiet that mid-morning Tuesday, a few residents coming and going, the concierge at the desk, the sound of the building living its ordinary life. I went through the glass doors and onto Peachtree Street, and the November air was clear and slightly cool, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment before I started walking. I thought about being 22 years old and sitting in a studio apartment in East Atlanta, doing the math on whether I could put another $100 into savings that month, deciding that I could. I thought about being 27 and sitting across from Marcus Webb in a coffee shop near Georgia State, spreading the acquisition analysis across a table between us, watching him read the numbers I had built from scratch, and watching his expression shift from polite interest to something more like recognition. I thought about being 29 and sitting in Patricia Hargrove's office for the first time in the preliminary and exploratory conversation, the one where I was just beginning to name to myself what I already knew. I thought about standing in this lobby 16 months earlier, watching Gregory walk across the marble floor toward me with his hand extended and the folder under his arm, and hearing Constance Callahan's voice change register in the silence after the words the owner's signature. "People like you," she had said. I started walking south on Peachtree. The sun was at the right angle to light up the glass facades of the buildings in a way that was almost architectural about it. Clean lines, reflected sky, the geometry of a city doing what cities do. People like me, I thought, had turned out to be exactly what I had always been, which was the problem with making assumptions about people you have decided, in advance, do not deserve your actual attention. I was 32 years old. I owned a building in Midtown Atlanta appraised at $8.4 million in the most recent assessment. The value had increased in the year since the last appraisal, as I had expected it would. Given the market conditions I had analyzed when I was 24 years old, sitting at a desk in East Atlanta doing math that no one else had asked me to do. I had a loft in Inman Park with morning light in the kitchen and hardwood floors, and a window I could put a chair in front of. I had Keandra, who was taking me to a jazz thing in Little Five Points on Saturday night. I had my mother, who was coming to visit in December, and who was going to stay in the loft's second room, and who I was going to take, one afternoon while she was here, to see the Peachtree building. The whole building, all 12 floors, the rooftop terrace, the wine bar with its reclaimed wood and its good natural light. She didn't know yet that it was mine. I had been waiting for the right moment to tell her. Not because I was hiding it, but because I wanted to see her face when she understood. I wanted to stand in the lobby of a building I had bought at 27 with money I had saved working at a firm she had made it possible for me to attend school to enter, and I wanted her to look around at the stone floors and the high ceilings and the city visible through the glass. And I wanted to say, "This is ours, Mama. This one is ours." That was what I was thinking about on Peachtree Street in November, walking south in the clean November air, with my coat on and my good shoes and my name on a building I could see if I turned around. I did not turn around. I had learned that some of the most important things you will ever do in your life are the things you do without looking back to see if anyone noticed. You notice. That's enough. There are things I know now that I wish I had understood sooner, and there are things I understand now that I could only have learned by going through exactly what I went through, and I have stopped trying to sort them into separate categories because the truth is, they are the same thing. What I gave 4 years of my life to learning was this: your perception of your own reality is not paranoia. When something doesn't add up, that is not anxiety. That is arithmetic, and arithmetic is reliable. Trust it. Documentation is not bitterness. It is preparation. Every statement I saved, every screenshot, every flagged transaction, every carefully kept record was not the act of a woman nursing a grudge. It was the act of a woman who understood that when the moment came to stand in a room and say this is what happened, she wanted to be the person in that room who could actually prove it. Be that person. Be meticulous. Keep the records. And this, which I would say to anyone who is sitting in a kitchen in Virginia Highland or Scottsdale or Oak Park or Plano or wherever you are, holding information you have been doubting yourself about for months or years, you do not owe anyone the management of your own silence. You do not owe anyone protection from the truth of what they did. The person who would benefit most from your silence is the person who created the situation that made it necessary. And that person has already demonstrated clearly that they are not protecting you. So stop protecting them. The version of me that stood in that lobby on a Friday morning in spring in a charcoal blazer with a manila envelope in her bag, had been built over 10 years of discipline and attention and work that no one had asked her to do, and no one had seen, and no one had credited. And it had been built precisely, in some essential way, for that moment. Not for the sake of the lobby scene, not for the performance of it, but for the fact of it. The plain, undramatic, fully documented fact that when the moment required the owner's signature, the signature was mine. That is what being prepared actually looks like. Not a confrontation you engineered, not a speech you rehearsed. Just the moment arriving and finding you already there, already holding what you built, already exactly who you had been quietly becoming. I have been a lot of things in my 32 years. I have been someone's daughter, and someone's wife, and someone's professional colleague, and someone's underestimated guest at a dinner table in Sandy Springs. I have been the person who said nothing when I should have started taking notes, and I have been the person who took notes for 14 months without saying a word until the moment when the notes were exactly what was needed. What I am now is harder to summarize, which I think means it's closer to real. I am the owner of a 12-story building in Midtown Atlanta. I am the resident of a loft in Inman Park with good floors and good light. I am the daughter of a woman who worked for 22 years so that I could understand what work actually builds. I am a woman who knows the difference between the peace of not knowing and the peace of having done what needed to be done, and who chooses every day to live in the second kind. The peace of not knowing is comfortable. It asks nothing of you. It lets you stay in the warm, familiar shape of a life you did not choose with your eyes open. I lived in that peace for too long. I understand why people stay in it. I don't blame anyone who is still in it. But I know what's on the other side. And it is not what they told you it would be. It is not lonely. It is not cold. It is not the consolation prize. It is the view from the 12th floor of a building you own on a morning when the light comes in at the right angle and the city is going about its business below you and there is no one in the room whose approval you are managing. It is the silence of a kitchen where the only schedule is yours. It is the sound of your own laughter, which turns out to be something you recognize immediately when it comes back, because it never stopped being yours. It was just somewhere you hadn't visited in a while. I went back to that place. I intend to stay. If any part of this story woke something in you, if there was a moment when you thought, I know what that feels like, or I know what it is to be in a room where someone has decided who you are before you've said a word, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, and tell me what stayed with you. And if you know someone who is still in the quiet of not knowing, who is making excuses for a person who stopped deserving those excuses a long time ago, send them this. Because sometimes the most important thing is just seeing that it is possible. To find out, to prepare, to walk into a room and let the papers land on the right side of the table. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. We tell stories here about women who decided that the truth was worth more than the comfort of not looking for it, and we tell them all the way to the end, where the consequences are real and the justice is documented and the woman is standing in the morning light of a life she actually chose. A strong hug to every one of you, and remember this: you don't owe anyone silence about what they did to you, especially not the people who were counting on it.